Well, here we are again. Another day, another Game Boy Advance Consolizing kit. But this one is a bit different than those we've seen to date. All the Consolizing kits for the Game Boy Advance that I've shown on this channel have in one way or another used the original GBA in some capacity. None have used the smaller, more compact SP. That is, until now. The folks over at GameBox Systems have just released a new variant of their GBHD line of Consolizing kits, the Advance SP. So, let's take a look. Hey everyone, how's it going? My name is Tito and welcome to another episode of Retro Renew. Today we'll be taking a look at another Consolizing kit for the Game Boy Advance, but with a slight twist. It seems that the retro community has really been churning out GBA Consolizing kits lately, and that's not a bad thing. With so much choice, we as modders are bound to find something that fits our needs. Now what makes this particular kit different from the rest is that it is the first GBA Consolizing kit that utilizes a motherboard from a SP. All the other kits I've shown to date use an original GBA motherboard or its parts. While the open source GBHD is compatible with both versions of the console, the DIY kit I used was designed around the original GBA, and I'm not aware of any kits that are readily available that use SP components besides this one. Now what this allows us to do is have a final product with a reduced overall size and footprint, and it also increases the pool of donor consoles available to us to do these types of mods. Now the case that this kit uses almost reminds me of a cube. Perhaps they were paying homage to the GameCube. I think that would have been pretty cool if they played a bit more into that theme. Anyway, before we had this kit available to us, we were essentially limited to only using original GBAs, but now GameBox has opened up the possibilities with this SP-based kit. Alright, so in this video, I'm going to show you the contents of the GBHD Advance SP Consolizing kit, then I'll demonstrate how to install it. I'll go over all of its features, review its pros and cons, and of course provide you with my overall thoughts. So the first thing we have is this two-piece 3D printed case. Again, it has a very unique, more cube-like design, which I really dig. The case was again designed by Dennis, or better known as Pointer Function. You may remember he also designed the GBHD case, which I showcased not too long ago. And as usual, the shells are manufactured in-house by Noble of GameBox Systems. Also in the kit is a SNES controller port, and a set of screws for assembling the case, as well as a 34-pin ribbon cable. Additionally, we get this custom quick solder flex ribbon. This should help make the installation easier and wire-free, which is always welcome. Both the quick solder and the 34-pin ribbon will connect to the last and most important item in the kit, the GBHD SP PCB, which features a FPGA front and center, as well as a full-size HDMI port and USB-C port to power the unit. Man, talk about alphabet soup. Alright, so that's everything included in the kit. Now let me show you how to put it all together. Okay, so first things first, we need to crack open the SP in order to grab its motherboard. Great, once the motherboard is free, we can set aside the rest of the console. But remember, we do need to hold onto the power switch cover, so don't forget that. Next up, let's prep the main FPGA board by soldering on the SNES port. Be sure that it's oriented as shown on the top side of the board. And when you're done, this is what it should look like. Next, grab the SP motherboard and bend in the flanges on both sides of the link port and the charge port. I'm using a pair of needle nose pliers to do this, but just be aware you don't want to bend them too much, otherwise you may have trouble connecting cables into these ports. Okay, now for the tricky part. Let's begin to solder in the quick solder flex ribbon by first tinning a few of the points on the motherboard. Let's start with test pad TP5 and TP4. We'll use these 2 points to anchor the flex ribbon cable to the motherboard. Now, quick note, what I later realized is we should have first pre-tinned all the points on the motherboard before soldering in the flex ribbon. While it's not completely necessary, I think it would have made the installation a little bit easier. Great, once those are tacked in, let's tack in a few more points on the ribbon. I'm using my tweezers to hold down the ribbon cable while I tack in the vias using my iron with a bit of solder on the tip. Okay, now I'm coming back to put in a proper solid solder joint to all the vias. Again, using tweezers to hold the flex ribbon flush of the board is very helpful for assuring a good weld. So here you can see that I'm propping up the ribbon cable to get it out of the way so that I can pre-tin this test pad. This is why it would have been just easier to pre-tin all these points prior to installing the flex ribbon. This point here was a bit tricky since the component by the flex ribbon was preventing it from being completely flush to the board. Again, here I'm pre-tinning the pads prior to soldering it in. Now, this part of the ribbon wasn't aligned perfectly, but there was more than enough slack to get it into the proper location. Definitely try to align the ribbon cable as best you can prior to tacking it in. Fantastic. Here's how all the points on the front of the motherboard should look like. Now on the other side of the board, we need to solder in these two large pads on the ribbon cable to these 2 points on the battery connector. By soldering to these 2 pads instead of the actual battery contacts, this mod will be completely reversible. So definitely solder to these 2 points and not to the battery terminals themselves. Unfortunately, I forgot to turn my camera on when I did this, but here's what the final result should look like. I used my multimeter to confirm that the joints were solid by testing continuity between the battery contact pins and my solder joint. Okay, so the hard part is over. Next, let's install the 34-pin ribbon cable to the SP with the contacts facing up. And then the other end to the FPGA board with the blue tab facing up, like so. Okay, now we need to connect the flex ribbon to the FPGA board by folding it over itself like so, and putting a gentle fold near the battery contacts. Flip the whole thing over, and then place the FPGA board on top of the flex ribbon. And then insert the cable into the board as shown. Before we do the final assembly, plug everything in and check to make sure that it's working. Confirm that you are getting a picture and that all the buttons work. I used an index card to insulate the boards from each other and to prevent any potential short. Great, everything checks out. Now we can begin to put everything into the case. And this is really where things started to get difficult for me. So first, we're supposed to drop the FPGA board in at an angle with the SNES port going in first. But no matter what I did, I couldn't get the board to fit. I finagled and massaged the board in as best I could, but it wouldn't budge. I tried to pry it in and use leverage with my spudger, but it was being pretty stubborn. So I came in with my craft knife and removed just a bit of material around the opening for the SNES port, as well as the opening for the HDMI port around back. At last, with a lot more force than I'm comfortable with, I was able to get it in. I then secured the PCB to the bottom shell using the 4 included self-tapping screws. Then, with some flush cutters, I trimmed the ends of this cover piece per the instructions, which prevents it from bowing when we install it into the case. Then I dropped the trim piece into the top shell as shown, along with the power switch cover. Then at an angle, I inserted the GBA motherboard into the top shell. This also presented some challenges, but not nearly as much as the bottom shell. I was able to wedge it in using my craft knife and a spudger. Once it was finally in place, I dropped in the included washers over the screw holes and then secured the motherboard with the included machine screws. I also tested the power switch to make sure it was actuating correctly before buttoning everything up. And with everything secured, I took the 2 halves and then snapped them together. And that's it. We have successfully put together the GBHD Advance SP. Alright, with the SP all put together, I have to say I really like the design, especially its smaller size. While the installation for the most part was very straightforward, I did have some issues putting everything together into the shell. I'll get more into that in just a minute, but for now, let's go over some of the primary features that this kit has to offer. First and foremost, like I've been mentioning several times in the video, the footprint is quite a bit smaller than most of the kits we've seen to date, with possibly the exception of the GBA HD kit from Consoles for You. This is primarily due to the fact that we are using the SP motherboard versus one from an original GBA. Overall, I like the size, and I think it's pretty cool that it has almost a cube-like shape. I think they could have played more into that design and perhaps made it look like a mini GameCube. That would have been really fun. Now, taking a look around back, we see that it sports a full-size HDMI port as opposed to a HDMI mini, which is pretty common on these types of mods. This is always welcome since we won't need to use an adapter or a special cable to hook it up to the television. It also features a USB-C port to power the unit. And they've designed the shell so that it is indeed compatible with all GBA link port accessories. Now, of course, all the primary features of this kit can be found in the OSD menu when the system is running. And since this is a GameBox product, the menu settings are very much the same as all their other Consolizing products, which isn't a bad thing. I think this is great for all those who are already in the GameBox ecosystem, as it should be very familiar to them. And because of that, I will be focusing on the more interesting menu settings here, but you can check out my other videos which cover the original GBHD and other GameBox kits in more detail. They'll be linked in the video description. Anyway, when you first turn the console on, the video output is set to 720p by default. Let's go ahead and access the on-screen display, or OSD, by pressing and holding the Start and Select button for a couple seconds. The OSD menu will show 4 categories: Display Settings, Picture Configuration, Miscellaneous Options, and Info. The main options we're interested in are the Display Settings and Picture Configuration. Let's start by going through some of the display settings. First up, we can choose from 3 resolutions. 480p, which scales the GBA's 240 by 160 resolution linearly 3 times, 720p, which is scaled 4 times, and 1080i, which is scaled 6 times. You can see on the screen how each resolution affects the image. I personally prefer 720p, but again, it's always good to have options. The next option we can adjust is scaling. Within each resolution, we have 3 scaling options. Proper, which displays the GBA's native aspect ratio, Stretch, which is the image stretched to fit your display, and TV, which is a slightly cropped in stretched image. Great, the main next category is picture configuration. Let's start with filter effects. By default, there is no filter, but you can choose between enhanced, smooth, and sharp. For me, I prefer no filter at all because I'm just a fan of those blocky pixels. You can see all the filter effects here on screen. After the filter effects, let's take a look at the grid lines, which gives the image that pixel grid effect. There are 3 options to choose from, again all shown on screen. Additionally, we also have scan lines, of which there are 3 options that adjust the thickness of the scan lines. I'm really glad GameBox added all these display effects, but for me, like I've said before, I prefer to have all these effects turned off. Alright, so those are the primary features of the GBHD SP. But now, let's get into the pros and cons. Starting with the pros, I think first and foremost, it's great to have a kit that allows the SP to be consolized. Up until this point, all the consolizing kits that I've looked at needed an original GBA motherboard or parts from that motherboard in order to work. Having the ability to also consolize SPs increases the pool of available systems that we can modify. Additionally, the SP's form factor lends itself to having an overall smaller footprint when compared to its counterparts. I for one prefer the smaller size. When compared to the GBA HD from Consoles for You, which is another small kit, they appear to perhaps have similar volume, but the SP does occupy a smaller footprint. Another pro is the flex ribbon cable. It makes tapping the needed points on the SP motherboard easier and also much cleaner. While I did run into some alignment issues, none were bad enough to impede the installation process and were easily maneuvered to their required locations. Additionally, if you install the flex ribbon like I did on the battery terminals, it is completely reversible and removable, allowing you to install the motherboard back into your original SP shell. This is a major plus. Okay, so those are the pros. But now, let's get into the cons. For me, the biggest con is the shell design. While aesthetically, I think it looks great, I had a fairly difficult time installing the 2 PCBs in it and then putting it together. it was a very tight fit and I had to exert quite a bit of pressure to get the boards in. I was worried I might break something. I did have to trim it a bit internally to get it to fit, but I did eventually get it. I think if GameBox went with a 3-piece shell design like they did for the GBHD, that could potentially allay this issue. Anyway, other than the shell, I think this is yet another fantastic option for getting the GBA's fantastic library onto the big screen. So now you may be asking, how much does this thing cost? Well, as far as price is concerned, the cheapest route that includes the 3D printed case would be their DIY kit, which costs about $160. And at the top of the spectrum, you have a fully built unit which will run you roughly $320. While that is pretty expensive, you do need to remember that includes the cost of the donor SP, as well as the labor to put it together. And again, I know I always say this, but we have to keep in mind that these aren't mass-produced products that benefit from economies of scale. Anyway, it's just kind of crazy to think we have over 5 different ways to consolize the Game Boy Advance. I have a dedicated playlist here so you can check them all out and compare them for yourself. Anyway, that about does it for this video. I hope you all have a wonderful holiday season and I wish you all a very happy new year. This will be the last time I see you in 2022, but I look forward to returning in 2023. Until then, take care.